As industrialization grew, the issues linked to it became more difficult to overlook. Some people of the middle and upper class noticed how the impoverished lived and desired to do something about it. Many Americans were unaware of the flight of factory and some workers until they read about it in books and newspaper articles authored by a group of writers known as the muckrakers. Journalist Ida Terrible reported about an oil company's unethical business practices. Lincoln Steffens uncovered political corruption in the nation's major cities. The Octopus, a story about California farmers' conflict with corporate railroads, gets written by novelist Frank Norris. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906, an insightful expose of the meatpacking industry's unsafe and unsanitary practices. These writers worked trick at the progressivists, the majority of whom were local college-educated middle and upper-class city residents. Progressivists demanded immediate changes in the hopes of improving society while preserving capitalism and democracy. The muckrakers, however, did not influence everyone. In fact, the muckrakers got their name from Theodore Roosevelt. He believed that the muckrakers were essential to society, but that they frequently went too far, focusing purely on the negative aspects of the subjects they covered. But Teddy Roosevelt was the progressives' most prominent advocate. Roosevelt was a passionate and popular Republican who despised political corruption. Roosevelt found himself as president in 1901 after William McKinley's death. Roosevelt delivered a statement to Congress shortly after taking office, stating that all laws and customs were no longer acceptable in the face of current societal issues. Roosevelt set out to persuade the American people that social change was needed and to gain support for a strategy, which he entitled the Square Deal. Roosevelt began by going after monopolies wherever he could. This was sometimes difficult because existing antitrust laws stated that business that did not engage in interstate commerce were not subject to federal government control. As a result, Roosevelt turned his attention to railroads, which were involved in interstate commerce. Roosevelt was successful in breaking up some railroad monopolies, such as Northern Securities, which had been pulling their forces to raise shipping costs. Northern Securities was ordered to be dissolved by the Supreme Court in 1904. Roosevelt's administration also prevailed in a case against Swift and Company, the beef trust, which had been conspiring to set high cattle prices. The government also won significant victories against the tobacco and oil trusts. The Roosevelt administration presented 44 antitrust cases to the Supreme Court, though he was not always successful. Roosevelt also disliked the fact that when there were labor disputes, the government usually favored business over protesters. When the United Mine Workers went on strike in 1902, Roosevelt stepped in. Mine workers wanted shorter working hours and higher pay. Mine owners responded by halting operations, hoping to ride out the strikes until the laborers could no longer afford to support themselves. This impacted the entire country because most homes were still heated by coal at the time. A lack of coal raised prices and harmed the finances of many Americans. In the hopes of resolving the strike and averting a national crisis, Roosevelt gathered at the White House with union leaders and mine owners. When the mine owners refused to negotiate with union representatives, Roosevelt became frustrated and threatened to have the army take over the mines. As a result, the mine owners agreed to give the strikers what they wanted: shorter hours and a pay raise. Roosevelt's actions set a historic precedent, as it was the first time a president intervened on labor's behalf. This made Roosevelt extremely popular among the public, who saw him as an advocate for their rights. As a result, Roosevelt was easily re-elected in 1904. In addition to trust busting, Roosevelt advocated for legislation that would prevent new trusts from being formed. The Hurtbun Act, acted in 1906, strengthened the already existing Interstate Commerce Commission by granting the ICC greater authority over maximum railroad freight rates. Roosevelt also advocated for reforms to the production and marketing of food and drugs. Before the meatpacking industry was regulated, it was common for meat factories to be rat-infested and unsanitary, as Upton Sinclair detailed in his book The Jungle. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906 endeavored to address this deplorable condition that existed in the previous year. Prior to new laws, the plant and drug industry was thriving, regardless of the fact that the remedies marketed were often nothing more than alcohol and coloring. The Food and Drug Act established guidelines for the safe preparation of medication and certain foods. Roosevelt was an outdoors enthusiast, an avid hiker and hunter, and many of his progressive policies were aimed at protecting the American wilderness so that future generations would share his love of nature. Pelican Island in Florida was designated as the first national wildlife preserve in 1903, and the Lackey Antiques Act was passed in 1906 to protect historical sites. The National Commission for the Conservation of National Resources was established in 1908. Roosevelt chose not to run in the election of 1908, instead supporting William Howard Taft. Taft had promised to carry on Roosevelt's progressive policies. During Taft's presidency, the Supreme Court handled 90 antitrust cases. The Mann-Elkins Act of 1910 increased the ICC's authority over the telephone and telegraph industries. Taft also reformed the federal government with anti-corruption measures, including enacting legislation requiring members of the House of Representatives to disclose who made payments to their campaign. Taft even followed Roosevelt's lead and acquired new land as New Mexico and Arizona became states in 1912. The Taft presidency was, in many ways, a continuation of the Roosevelt administration. But there was one significant difference between Taft and Roosevelt: the importance they both placed on conservation. Taft was far more restrictive than Roosevelt when it came to protecting natural resources, and he failed to enact much new legislation on the movement's behalf. This enraged Roosevelt, who felt rightfully betrayed by Taft. In 1912, Roosevelt ran for the New Progressive Party against Republican Taft and Democratic Woodrow Wilson. After Roosevelt made a remark about rolling like a bull moose, the party became known as the Bull Moose Party. The Bull Moose Party did very well in the elections, outnumbering the Taft by 600,000 votes, but Roosevelt's party split the Republican vote, allowing the Democratic candidate, a former New Jersey government named Woodrow Wilson, to win the election with only 41% of the popular vote. Wilson was similar to Roosevelt in priorities. To Wilson fought hard to lower tariffs, and the Underwood Tariff Act was passed in 1913. This act eliminated taxes on food, iron, and wool, as well as drastically reduced taxes on a variety of other items. As a result of the decrease in revenue for the federal government, Congress enacted the first federal income tax in 1913, as provided for by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. The income tax changed the way the federal government generated revenue, and varying of the tax was in how designed is still in use today. The 17th Amendment to the Constitution was also ratified in 1913. It established the direct election of Union senators. Previously, senators were appointed by state legislators, but Wilson gave the American people the opportunity to choose their own senators. Wilson introduced a more directive democracy to American people in the form of an initiative referendum and recall. The right to initiate legislation was granted to voters through the initiative process. Legislation could be approved or vetoed through a referendum. Voters could recall an elected official from office through a special election. These new rights gave citizens a greater say in politics. But Wilson's reforms did not end there. Wilson also attacked the banking trust, depriving it of its power. The Owen-Glass Act, passed by Congress, established the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve System essentially established a central bank and 12 regional banks that were overseen by a Federal Reserve Board. This board kept inflation under control by setting interest rates and adjusting the money supply. This gave the federal government control over banking rather than the money trust. Wilson then established the Federal Trade Commission in 1914 to investigate corporations and put an end to unfair business practices. The Clayton Antitrust Act was passed by Congress the same year. The law strengthened the existing Sherman Antitrust Act by making interlocking directories illegal, which meant that corporate heads could not control more than one company in the same or related fields where they could create monopolies and control prices. The Clayton Antitrust Act made strikes and boycotting legal, giving an enormous boost to labor unions, which were previously viewed as a threat to American capitalism. Since the early 1990s, unions have grown in strength, with two unions boasting large members and significant influence over laborers, the Conservative American Federation of Labor and Radically Socialist International Workers of the World. A fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York City on March 25, 1911. 146 of the 500 female workings in sweatshop-like conditions would perish. Management negligence and unsafe working conditions were at fault. The management locked the doors leading to the exits to keep the women working at the sewing machines all day. The panicked women tried to flee as the fire spread quickly, fueled by fabric. The poorly maintained fire escape collapsed, killing many people and forcing many more to jump to their deaths to avoid being burned. A few days later, 80,000 people marched to protest the dangerous working conditions that had resulted in a fatality. The affected owners were convicted of manslaughter charges. Women were typically not permitted to join labor unions and were placed reforms that helped clean up factories where men worked, often did little to benefit women. Similarly, progressive reforms generally ignored problems of racial, ethnic, and religious persecution, and with no government support, minority groups were forced to seek reform on their own. Women were still treated as second-class citizens in the early 1900s, with few states granting them the right to vote, make legal decisions, or own property. Women had few job opportunities, and married women were expected to be full-time wives and mothers. Though the suffrage movement had been around for decades by the start of the Progressive Era, the progressive environment motivated women's groups fighting for the right to vote. Organizations such as the National American Women's Suffrage Association held rallies and vigorously advocated on their behalf. Slowly, more state government listened to suffragettes and expanded women's voting rights. The federal government eventually followed as well, as the 19th Amendment, ratified in 1920, granted women national voting rights. African Americans, like women, were frequently prohibited from joining labor unions, and thus were largely unable to benefit from higher wages and safer working conditions. President Wilson was a supporter of segregation, and during his presidency, black and white federal employees were required to use separate restrooms and dining areas. If African Americans wanted social advancement, it became clear that it had to come from within their own community. When Booker T. Washington founded the Tuskegee Institute in 1881, two extraordinary African American men rose to the occasion. The Alabama School prepared African Americans for careers in trade and agriculture. During the Progressive Era, Washington's institute grew in popularity as a result of his endless speaking tours, in which he actively sought the respect of white America. Washington accepted segregation, but taught that African Americans could earn respect and dignity through hard work and moral character. Washington was an intelligent man and a gifted orator, but his words irritated many Americans. Washington's willingness to accept segregation and his values to demand basic civil rights were examined by a man who would go on to become one of the century's most important civil rights leaders. W.E.B. Du Bois was a brilliant thinker, writer, speaker, and activist who was the first African American to obtain a doctorate from American University. Du Bois co-founded the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1909 and edited its news journal, Crisis. Du Bois emphasized that African Americans should be proud of themselves and demand their civil rights rather than allowing those rights to be systematically eroded. By 1914, Europe had been consumed by war. When the United States entered the war in 1917, the Progressive Era faded as the nation's attention shifted to what was happening in Europe rather than what reforms were being implemented. While the issues of monopolies and government corruption have been effectively addressed, there was still much work to be done. World War I would mark the end of an era, but many progressive policies were merely placed on hold. The Progressive Era was a turning point in American history. It forever changed social perspective, monopolies, corruption, and America as we know it today.